So before I get into this video essay, I want to say definitely spoilers. Yeah, definitely major spoilers for Mickey 17. And also I'm going to be talking about some pretty heavy concepts in this one, like just maybe could trigger some like dissociation, depersonalization feelings. That's what I struggle with, so I just wanted to put that out there. It is a pretty heavy thing to talk about, and if you're not in the mood for it, it's totally fine. So I want to start this off by asking you a question, asking the audience a question. Do you think surveillance is wrong? Do you think that 24/7 government or other surveillance is wrong? Do you think that's acceptable or okay, depending on any context? Like, make that decision for yourself. Now, what you've just done is created a held belief. So what I've been trying to make you do is just create an idea that you believe in. Now, would you still agree to your original answer if I said that this 24/7 surveillance would make it so no violence would ever happen again? Like, there would be no mass violence or individual violence ever again. And if you hesitated with that even for a second, you might have triggered some psychological discomfort. Maybe you didn't hesitate at all, maybe you stuck with your original answer, but either way, when we're offered new information and it clashes with our originally held belief, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. Now, what I want to get at today is the idea of cognitive dissonance, the extreme psychological discomfort we feel when we have a very deeply held belief and new information counteracts that, but we're holding both of those things at the same time. So when we are given new information in our day-to-day lives, we have pretty much three options on how to handle new information. Number one, you could accept the information as true, change your worldview, and move on. So you could accept that maybe you don't know everything and then change the way you see things, change your opinion, and move on. You can, two, reject that information as untrue or not based on anything that you think is reputable. So you could just reject the information entirely. This can be hard if it's something that you have to deny that's happening to your senses. So this rejection of a thing that's being presented to you can actually be denying your own senses sometimes. And number three, you can change the information to conform to your existing worldview. So this is a pretty dangerous one because it can be very, very hard to recognize in yourself and also break. This is where a lot of conspiracy theories come in. This is where a lot of twisting of realities comes in. This is where it gets really, really confusing. But what I want to talk about in Mickey 17 is what would happen if an entire gigantic group of people had extreme cognitive dissonance and there was a leader that was exploiting that, using their influence to create mass denial of reality. What would that look like? So Mickey 17 is the newest in a lineup of movies by Bong Joon-ho. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not going to pretend I know. He also did Parasite and Snowpiercer, and he does these not so subtle critiques of power structures and like life is very unfair. Like, he does a very obvious critique of that in all of his media. So today I'm going to analyze Mickey 17, and I'm going to talk about unquestioning loyalty, cognitive dissonance, the dangers of blind trust in leaders, and how that can make us lose our fucking minds. This film is from a South Korean director and writer, and a lot of the comments I'm seeing about this movie is that it's too silly or it's too obvious, and I want to offer a rebuttal. A lot of South Korean thrillers have this, like, I'd almost call it a comic book campy quality that is really like dramatized and over the top, but it's on purpose and it's a style. It's like, I feel like I've noticed it in a cultural stylistic way. Like with Train to Busan specifically, you can see this like really exaggerated, like not only the movements of the actors themselves, but just the storyline. It's very dramatic in a really intense way, and Mickey 17 has a lot of those elements. And before I would call it simplistic or like it's too surface level or it's too silly, see what it exists in and then it will make a little bit more sense to you. I think this movie beautifully combined like more Western style filmmaking with South Korean thriller horror filmmaking. I thought it was so beautifully done. I'm specifically thinking about the scenes of people just crawling over each other in like this really dramatic kind of amalgamation of people way. That was insane. It's like an art piece. It's just so cool. So obviously, if you've seen Mickey 17, you know I don't need to really analyze it all that much because the plot and the message are very, very, very clear, similar to his other films. But I think there is more here to analyze about how this film relates to our real life and about just clones in general. So this film is set in a dystopian future where a group of human colonists are sent to a distant planet to try and make it livable because Earth is dying and people are desperate to escape. Our main character, Mickey, is desperate to escape because of a loan shark, so he's more desperate than everyone else, but everybody wants to escape onto these like corporate-owned spaceships that are leaving Earth and trying to colonize their planet. There's a haunting scene in the beginning of this film that shows a giant dust storm raging outside of one of these onboarding kind of like corporate centers where they're shipping people out, and people are trying to get jobs on these spaceships. And it's just this really freaky, scary scene where everyone is calmly waiting in line, and then outside there's like this horrible dust bowl storm, and then like automatically these like wipers wash all the dust off the windows, like electronically. They have this water running down, just like wasting water. It's just this really scary aura that this is totally normalized. And there's also this like creepy advertisement voiceover in the background, just like advertising to people standing in this line. And they're just standing there like everything's fine. So the story follows Mickey, played by Rob Pattinson. And the first thing I noticed was that he's not like a usual astronaut. He is pretty average intelligence. And I'm saying that as someone who has average intelligence. He obviously doesn't know all the science going on behind stuff. He explains stuff in a really like the way that I would explain it if I saw it. Just kind of baseline knowledge of the world, not really like a scientist. And this is important because when we usually see astronauts, they're really smart and they've studied for years and they've done all this extensive training. Mickey is just a random guy. Like, he's truly just a working class random guy. But it's pretty obvious at the very beginning he's going to be expendable, and that is the entire point of the movie. This loan shark that he's running from is like this really super ultra wealthy guy who likes to torture people, saw them to death into pieces if they don't pay him back. That's his payment if they don't pay him back, and Mickey doesn't want to be sawed to death and tortured, so he's so scared and he's jumping on one of these spaceships. His life is so dystopian and weird. Everything in this universe is, but that sucks. Like, his situation really, really does suck badly, and he's still like weirdly optimistic about his life, but it is a horrible situation. So he signs up to be part of this experimental group of people who are called expendables, and they are basically clones. So his consciousness will get transferred to the next clone, so he's not technically a new person, but he has to die repeatedly to do experiments for the spaceship, go on expendable missions, etc. You can imagine the amount of things that they could use him for. His body and brain is cloned and uploaded so he can be revived every single time. And this film explores specifically the 17th and 18th version of Mickey. He's a little different each time, which I think is really interesting how this writer thinks of nature versus nurture, because if Mickey's a little bit different every time he's cloned, it means that there's something other than just what is physically biological with the brain in shaping your personality. Mickey being a bit different each time, even though his consciousness is the exact same and his biological brain is the same, like it's cloned, I would think that that means the writer is inferring that there's some kind of thing as souls or some kind of thing as a supernatural consciousness, because if it were just his cloning process working as it should, he would be the exact same every time. So I think that's interesting. He also has a girlfriend, partner, Nasha, who loves every single version of him, which is very sweet. Their relationship is really, really, really sweet. And you wouldn't expect that from this movie. You'd expect it to be like horrifying and sad. In this film, there are also tons of Easter eggs about clones being made illegal on Earth because people were doing weird shit with them. Just this movie is packed full of plots and lore and just things you can really analyze, dig your teeth into. But it's not hard to understand. Like, it's just such an enjoyable movie, and it's truly like really fun to watch. But Mickey 18 is different because he's very, very self-aware, and very, very angry and aggressive about the injustices that have happened to him. Like, he's been brutally murdered a lot of times, and Mickey 18 seems to be the most aggressive one. And what this movie shows is there's accidentally two Mickeys alive at the same time, which is pretty obvious by the trailers. But Mickey 18 is very, very angry because he gets to interact with Mickey 17 and see how he's letting people walk all over him, and this is really frustrating for Mickey 18. And he gets so angry, he wants to murder the head of the space exploration and the head of the company, played by Mark Ruffalo. And this Mark Ruffalo character is essentially like a corporate dictator. He's obviously an oligarch of some kind, but he has a lot of cultural power, and people follow him around like a cult and kind of just do whatever he says. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today most of all. But this billionaire oligarch's name is Kenneth Marshall, and he has a rabid fan base of probably millions of people. They're very dedicated, very trusting of him. Their blind trust leads this expedition into a black hole of psychopathy and human rights violations and injustices and really, really bad colonization. So Nasha and Mickey and countless other people on this ship live in tiny compartments. They eat the shittiest food, and they have very tightly controlled lives. Most of the people on this ship, their living space sucks. Their clothes are all gray, and like everything's monotone. Everything is horrible. There's this really horrifying scene for me, like as a Taurus who is obsessed with food. There's a scene where Mickey is taking like a little extra from the cafeteria and putting it onto his tray, and the tray recognizes that it's like 15 calories over, and there's like an alarm that goes off. And if I were living in that universe, like seriously, take me out. I'm not doing that. It gets to the point that Marshall is actually trying to ban Smacks. Because it wastes too many calories. And if that's not like an indication of how tightly these people's lives are controlled, I don't know what is. They've taken everything away from people. And for Mickey, they've taken dying away from him. Mickey is the most exploited person on the ship, and he's tortured to death 16 times. These people's suffering and existence is horrible. They live at the whim of Kenneth Marshall's like interest or what he wants to do at the time. And Kenneth Marshall is dumb as rocks. He's not even smart, so that's the most annoying part. Marshall is fueled by a desire to be adored without hesitation, and his goal in the end is to eradicate and torture the sentient life forms on a planet they are trying to colonize. So that's basically what is happening in the movie, and that's the very, very gist of it. But why would thousands of people on this ship live in basically squalor, while Marshall and his wife and his higher-ups live in like a weird opulence luxury lifestyle? Why would so many people be okay with eating disgusting food on water rations, while video live streams from Marshall and his wife room shows chandeliers and Persian rugs? Why would so many scientists, generals, and people be okay with Marshall using his power to annihilate an entire species of aliens? And why does it take 17 Mickeys for him to get angry about his own torture and exploitation? The answer to this is cognitive dissonance. And Kenneth Marshall is weaponizing this cognitive dissonance in his followers and even on the people on the ship who don't particularly like him. And in Mickey 17, the director is trying to show you that there is no breaking point that will break this cognitive dissonance for people. It doesn't matter how horrible your life gets. It doesn't matter what is taken away from you. You need to break that yourself, because no amount of struggle or pain is going to get you to that point. You need literally 17 Mickeys to get to that point. If like struggle, pain, torture, whatever was enough, the first Mickey would have said, "This, I'm done." But it took 17 of them. Things will just get really, really bad until it kind of goes up in smoke. But why are people so, as like a general population, why are we so willing to accept reality like this, even when it goes against what we believe or what we want out of life? This film is deeply uncomfortable because Marshall is so obviously a horrible leader who is nothing but selfish, but it takes everyone like so much struggle and so much stuff to actually change it, and the majority of the ship still is against Mickey and Nasha when they're trying to change what's going on. So let's talk about why people fall in line this way. What's the psychology behind people doing this? I personally think the fundamental part of it, and I think the lifeblood of this movie, is that death is really, really scary. Mickey says it himself a couple of times. He says that death is really, really scary and he never gets used to it. The fear of our own mortality is something that makes it very, very easy for people to accept when there's like a great leader who says everything's going to be okay. And that existential dread is really easy to weaponize. When someone is telling you that everything's just going to be great, fantastic, you can ignore the world crumbling around you and your own mortality way easier. And it's honestly probably way more fun. It's just like the scene of people waiting calmly in line while the earth is literally in ruin in the outside. People are calmly just waiting because they're listening to this advertisement saying everything's going to be fine. We're going to colonize new planets. We're on the up and up. And it's literally less painful for them to listen to the advertisement than to look around and be like, everything's... For lots of people, including myself, in our own day-to-day lives, it's so much easier and more comfortable to turn your head away from destruction and violence because the truth is very, very painful sometimes. It's much easier to believe the lie that everything's fine because it means you don't really have to do anything. And this is where the cognitive dissonance is so strong that it becomes a literal brick holding up your entire identity. So, for example, lots of people have the belief that they're good and rational human beings. But if you're in a line to leave the planet that you're on that is dying, and you're very calm and casual about that, while you're listening to like Kenneth Marshall advertisements at you saying everything's amazing, that contradicts that belief that you're a rational and good person. Because a good rational person would be doing something and wouldn't be able to stand there and pretend that everything's okay. But when reality is challenging something as fundamental as like, I'm a good person, that's extremely painful. And that's a kind of psychology that's really hard to get to, even from a therapist perspective. Like, to reach people at that level is so hard, let alone letting people come to that themselves is like something that is sometimes impossible. It is so much more comforting to listen to Kenneth Marshall say it's fine and also believe that they're good people, because that can let them go on another day. So let's talk about some examples in the real world of people doing this exact thing, having extreme levels of cognitive dissonance in gigantic groups. First, I want to talk about the Milgram experiment. This was a psychological study conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University, and it was investigating how far people would go to obeying authority. It's actually really surprisingly easy to get normal, rational, nice people to do really, really horrible things if authority tells them to. The participants were told they were part of a study on learning and memory, and each was assigned the role of a teacher who was asking questions to a learner. And they didn't know this, but the learners were actually actors. The teacher was instructed, like the participant teacher, was instructed to administer electric shocks to the learner every time the learner got a question wrong. The shocks were fake, but the teachers didn't know that, and then they were just administering them to actors. They didn't know that. So they put like an authoritative lab coat person in these rooms with the teacher and the learner, and the authoritative presence instructed them to increase the shock level each time they got another answer wrong. The machine had labels ranging from mild shock to deadly level, and the learner sitting in another room would audibly protest, scream in pain, and eventually fall asleep as the voltage increased. But despite the actor literally screaming in pain, 65% of the participants obeyed the authoritative figure in the lab coat and administered the deadliest shock level to them. And not one of them stopped before reaching 300 voltage, even when the learner was screaming. So this is just one study that does scientifically show that regular people will pretty much do anything for authority figures, even kill someone. It's really interesting to look at obedience this way, because I do have a theory that like authoritative figures give people reprieve from that constant threat of death. I do think that, and I don't think there's any other explanation as to why people are so in huge swaths, like why they are so willing to do things they would never usually do. Because how many people out of that participation study do you think walked out of there still thinking that they were good people? Like, most people think that they're good people, but most people scientifically would kill someone in an experiment. I'm also going to talk about the Stanford prison experiment, which is similarly like done by college students. The Stanford prison experiment is super famous. It was done by this guy Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University, and it's like controversial because it would never be done now because it was actually fucked up. But it basically showed that when 24 random male college students were placed in the role of either prisoner or guard, within literally one day, guards began asserting power, humiliating the prisoners, enforcing harsh punishments like sleep deprivation and forced exercise, and prisoners basically immediately became submissive, distressed, and emotionally broken. Even though they all knew this was like an act, just putting the authoritative roles in there, immediately people took to them and started abusing each other. And this escalated so badly to the point that the main guy putting on the experiment stopped it early because people were getting hurt. It's been called inhumane. Like, this experiment was called inhumane, and it was very controversial. And it was just putting people in a room and telling them that they had authority over other people. People conform so quickly to roles of authority and submission. What kind of cognitive dissonance do you need to have to like know you're a fake prisoner, hold the belief that you're a fake prisoner, hold the belief that you're a fake guard, and still go into those roles in an extreme way and basically let it become your identity for a while? So that idea I was talking about, that like the fear of death is behind all of this, is an actual theory. It's a psychological theory developed by 3 different psychologists in the 1980s, and it basically says human behavior is influenced by the awareness of death and the need to manage the existential anxiety it creates. So this theory basically says that to manage this kind of anxiety that is caused by the looming threat of death and that existential threat, we cope in different fundamental ways to help us deal with this. And there's 3 main ways that people deal with this. The first one is religions, traditions, culture, things that give you a hammock to feel at home in the world. This can even be a sense of permanence, like belief in heaven or an afterlife, or even patriotism, thinking that you're going to do something for the betterment of your country and its future. The second one is self-esteem, because personal significance is like a buffer and you think that you're important in a world full of existential fear. People are constantly trying to achieve importance in life, and that helps stave off these ideas that we're going to die one day. And the third way we cope is this idea of like in-groups and out-groups, where people defend their worldviews by aligning with those who share their beliefs and rejecting those who don't. So this can be like prejudice, racism, religious intolerance, etc. By othering other people and creating your in-group, you can feel better about death anxiety. And so those are the 3 ways that we do it. Not all the best ways to cope. But what I'm trying to say with this is there are many ways to manage this death anxiety that makes us really susceptible to listening to authority. Because if we don't manage this death anxiety in a healthy way, we end up submitting to authority way easier, in my opinion. It's really easy for leaders to weaponize this really quickly because people have cracked the code on what triggers this anxiety. Studies show that when people are reminded of their own death, like through disasters, being near cemeteries, or through mass events, people become more defensive of their cultural values, more nationalistic, and more likely to conform to authority. If somebody wanted a huge group of people to defend something with their life, they'd most likely remind them of death in certain ways, like bombarding them with really violent news. Experimental evidence also shows that when people are primed with thoughts of death, they become harsher in moral judgments and more aggressive towards outsiders. Also, people are more likely to seek symbolic immortality when they're primed with these thoughts a lot or plagued by these thoughts of death anxiety. And these symbolic immortality ideas could be like having a lot of kids, extreme religious belief, or like achievements that will last your lifetime and beyond. So I think in the Mickey 17 universe, Kenneth Marshall has weaponized a lot of these ideas to make people kind of agree with what he has to say all the time. For example, like Kenneth Marshall has taken over the news and every single entertainment that's on the ship. So he's basically in charge of all the entertainment. And not only is it very overstimulating, but it's very like grandiose and extreme. It's not really calming people's nervous systems on the ship. It's like whipping everyone up into a frenzy. And when he sees the aliens, he's immediately like, we need to defend the human race against these aliens. And he's weaponizing people to kill a bunch of innocent aliens that didn't do anything wrong. He's like immediately wants to use violence and immediately says that they're a threat. Like there's no debate. So death anxiety and weaponizing that is just one of the reasons why the people on the ship are so easily submitting to Kenneth Marshall's whims. And I'm not saying everybody on that ship loves Kenneth Marshall, but everybody is letting him do whatever the fuck he wants. And not only his inner circle, but like the general society in the ship is majority just letting him destroy everything. They already let him basically destroy the planet. You can infer that kind of from the movie, in my opinion. Another psychological explanation for this is the idea of groupthink and the idea that people actually do not want freedom of decision. So groupthink is not only in the book 1984, I believe it is in 1984, but it's also like a theory by Irving Janis in 1972, and it explains why in large groups of people we make bad decisions. We make irrational decisions, unethical decisions, ones that are bad for all of us. Decisions like leaving planet Earth in ruins to go find another planet. That's a bad decision. Why did all the people make this decision? Groupthink happens for a few reasons. It can happen, obviously, people in the group valuing the unity of the group more than critical evaluation. It's also helped by a lot of isolation from other groups, like being on a spaceship. It often has a leader that is very, very authoritative and kind of more of a dictator leader. Illusions of perfection. So the group thinks that it can't really do anything wrong. You see this specifically with Mickey. People do not think what they're doing to him is wrong. By no one I mean most people aren't critically thinking that's really bad that we do that to Mickey. Even the scientist who has empathy towards him, who we see this really like sweet scientist, young woman, she even doesn't really do anything to stop it. So there's also in these groups a pressure for consensus. So people in the groups are pressured to agree with each other, and you're kind of deemed an outsider if you don't agree. We see this with Nasha when she does start disagreeing and start doing things that are going against what people expect her to. She gets put in jail, space jail. So some symptoms of this groupthink happening are unquestioned belief in success, pressure on people that challenge the social norms, self-censorship, and in the way that people are censoring their own ideas that maybe things are bad. They don't say that outwardly, or at least not to the leader. So this happens in the real world all the time, not only with like small cults, but like huge movements. Like people have groupthink all the time and they get into these cohesive groups and it's kind of impossible to escape them sometimes. That happens all the time. But again, why do people form these groups? And is it maybe because they don't want choices? There's a book called The Fear of Freedom, and it's like a social psychology book that explores the effects of freedom on people, and maybe people don't want it at all. So the general idea is that being liberated to kind of do whatever you want, it feels empowering and it feels free, but people most often go towards more oppressive structures because it removes the responsibility of your actions. So you can pretty much do what you want to do and not have any responsibility for them if you're under like a leader. In this book, this guy argues that many individuals, once liberated from oppressive political or social structures, will actually regress and fear the burden of freedom, because that's the burden of responsibility, and it's the burden of trying to know oneself and know what you want. And people really easily fall into submitting to authoritative behaviors. It's also a huge part of it is the idea that people want safety and they want security. And for some people, that certainty and security is way more alluring than the idea of freedom. So just being secure in what you think your future is going to look like and whatever can kind of ease that anxiety. And that kind of goes back to death anxiety. You kind of don't think you're going to die if you feel really secure. And like your next 10 years are planned and there's nothing that can happen to disrupt that. Fromm also really interestingly identifies a few things that people do to like escape this burden of personal responsibility of freedom. Conformity is number one. We all do that. We all have conformity. We all want to be accepted. Authoritarianism, so just submitting to authoritarian structures, people, whatever, relieves this anxiety of freedom. And adopting a more submissive role is a lot easier. Like it really is. Also destructiveness. So engaging in like self-destructive behaviors can ease the discomfort of freedom, because for a while it takes that choice away from you. You might be asking again, like, why do people submit to people like Marshall so easily? It could be many of reasons. It could be this fear of death anxiety. It could be it's just more comfortable to submit your freedom to somebody else. And it could also be you just want to be accepted in a group and you feel safe in a group. And finally, it could be suddenly it's way, way, way easier to look to an authoritarian than to look at the reality that is really, really scary and bad. And with all these studies and philosophies, there are obviously a lot of Kenneth Marshalls in real life. Even in cult leaders, there's a lot of Kenneth Marshalls. People that are weaponizing these things that happen that make people really, really pliable and using it for their own gain, whether that's money or power. Marshall has complete control of everything in this spaceship that people do. Kenneth Marshall really loves the idea of like human exceptionalism. So like spreading the seed of humanity and we are better than every other species. Even though in Mickey 17, the alien species is like a lot smarter than us, but we must advance the human race across the galaxy. So he's kind of employing a lot of these tactics. He's saying that we're going to go extinct. Like he's scaring people into wanting more security, wanting more authoritarianism. You also see this spiritual leader next to him at all times, which I think is a great metaphor for how some religions do this to people, where they're like making them very pliable for certain things like money. And spoiler alert, Kenneth Marshall does die. And at the very end, the way that he dies just makes a lot of sense. At the very last minute, he's still trying to trigger some kind of death anxiety in Mickey 18, who's killing him, trying to make him more pliable to authoritarianism so he doesn't kill him, and he needs security so he keeps him alive, but Mickey 18 kills him. That's really quite interesting. It's like in his last moments he was still trying to manipulate people. The last thing I want to talk about is the ethics of cloning, because it's so bad and it's such a absurd indicator that society on this ship is failing and is not good, because people are so easily accepting that Mickey is being cloned and killed a bunch of times. It doesn't really matter what scientific advancements we have, cloning is unethical. Dolly the sheep was the first cloned animal in real life. Dolly was a test tube clone and she started aging and dying prematurely. So nature says do not clone. You also got to ask yourself if a cloned human is a real human at all, because you also see cloning go off the chain horrible in the book Brave New World. In the book Brave New World, like they weaponize cloning to basically control every aspect of reproduction. And they also are making like genetically engineered classes for certain hierarchies in society. And it's just like heavily controlled. And there's clones for specific jobs. So you have like basically a biological caste system that you can never break out of, and you're born for a job like that. And that's so unethical. Like, not only because clones are predisposed to think of themselves as expendable. Like Mickey, the minute he's born out of the machine, knows he's expendable and he's thinking of himself as lesser, and that's compounding over every Mickey, and it takes like Mickey 18 to kind of break that cycle. But if clones are full stop born and thinking of themselves as less, that's enough for it to be unethical in itself. Also, interestingly, in Brave New World, the government gives people a drug that makes them like blissfully ignorant and compliant. And I think that's interesting because to accept the horrors of this cloning caste system and like all the other horrible shit going on in Brave New World, but like to accept that the people need to be blissfully unaware and ignorant to carry on. And also at the end of the day, Mickey is kind of like a living paradox where if you replaced all of the parts of a ship, at what point is that a different ship or is it the same ship? Mickey's, all of his parts are replaced. Is that Mickey or is that something else? So basically what this society has done is made itself into God. It's put itself in the position of God in so many different ways. And there's just a lot of ways to enjoy this movie. And it being kind of so easy to understand doesn't take away from what questions it's asking. I don't have the answers at all, but I will say it encourages you to critically think about things and just try to limit the cognitive dissonance part of your life, because the more that we accept new information, change our minds, be willing to accept that we're wrong, be willing to accept that we're infallible, kind of the more empathetic and better people will be. I fear that no amount of authoritarianism or no amount of like out-grouping people is gonna calm that anxiety that comes with just being a human who has mortality and who is responsible for their own happiness. That's the scariest thing of all. But I did like how the movie ended on a very positive note because they were able to start creating a new and better society. Loved that part of it. It could have ended on a really negative note, but it didn't. So I really enjoyed that part. And if you watched to the end, thank you for watching. We're in a tiny bit of a horror movie drought. I just saw Opus and I thought it was 5 stars good. I really like the song too, but people didn't like it that much. So I don't know if I'm going to make a video essay or anything about it because it seems like people didn't like it and I don't want to make a video that people won't really agree with. If you haven't seen Mickey 17, go see it in the theater before it goes away. Not spawns. It's just a really good movie. Okay, peace and love, and thanks for watching.